Okay, today I'm joined by Richard Ashfaw, Chief Marketing and Growth Officer at Monogram Group. It's a boutique brand. They're a boutique branding partner to B2B brands, private equity firms, and their portfolio companies. Richard, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Chris. Appreciate it.
Of course, kind of jumping straight into things, would you mind giving us like the 2-minute overview of how you got to where you're at today in this role at Monogram?
Yeah, no problem. So I come from a long lineage of marketers in my family. My father and grandparents were all either marketers, PR people, salespeople. So it was actually inevitable that I was gonna be a marketer myself, right? So I kind of grew up in that whole mindset. I ended up going to obviously, college and grad school and really focusing most of my studies around international studies, right? So international relations, international law, international economics, and then international marketing. But eventually kind of focusing that international education to then the actual function of marketing. So the reality is at the core, an international marketer. And then straight out of graduate school, I went and worked, believe it or not, on Wall Street in New York. So I started really my career, which is now going on roughly about 25 years, as a financial marketer. So in a way, it's almost like the tale of two careers, which is I first roughly 10, 12 years of my career, I was a financial marketer. And then I pivoted and started working in the consulting industry. And that was roughly around 2008, something like that, where I took my first consulting position at AC Carney, which is, one of the larger consulting firms in the world, a true management consulting firm. And I was hired to not only market and brand AT Kearney, but also do work on behalf of AT Kearney's clients. So that was really my first foray into consulting. And since that point, roughly since, like I said, 2008, I've been working within the management consulting field or even the agency side of things. So that I would say I'm an expert in they both have a very similar business model, meaning management consulting firms and agents. And that's really what I've been focusing on really for the last roughly, 15 years of my career. So I love building small to mid-size management consulting firms or agencies. But what's also amazing about it is that I can also work for the clients themselves, obviously promoting kind of and consulting on marketing, sales, branding, PR, communications. So that's really my expertise. So again, I love building consulting firms, building companies from the ground up, but I also love working for the clients of those firms as well. So
Very cool. And I can see how your experience at and inside the New York Stock Exchange in financial marketing correlates to private equity and the numbers and all of that. Like I'm sure you have a level of awareness on the financials that other marketers maybe don't have. Could you speak a little bit about that?
I love that question. It's so true. It's funny because I've always said that marketing is really at the intersection of both something that's purely analytical and creative. I really truly believe that to be a strong marketer, you have to have both of the kind of understandings of, analytics and the creative side of things, right? So I am that. I am both analytical and creative, and it was absolutely unbelievable the experience that I had working for financial companies because it really then gave me a true understanding of how to run a business, right? So I learned early on working on Wall Street and working for financial companies, everything there was to learn about finances and, capital markets and fundraising and all these really kind of intricate financial issues. And then that helped me also when I'm helping these companies kind of grow and expand or potentially even doing an IPO or even doing an acquisition or a merger or whatever it is. I have a really good understanding of those things by given the time, the fact that I worked for, Wall Street firms for about 10 years. So, and then you bring in all that creative into it as well. And it's an amazing thing, right? So yeah, it's a great question. I don't get asked that very often, but I love the question because the reality is I feel like any really strong marketer has to have a really good understanding of true business issues, finances, operations, but then obviously the marketing side, the branding side of things. So
Yeah, I agree because literally as a steward of someone's money, their marketing dollars, if you don't understand those numbers, how can you properly make assessments and analyze and, steer the direction of growth, And so for you, Richard, as the chief growth officer of Monogram, what are some of what's the vision that you're kind of chugging towards and build it out for the future?
Yeah, sure. So we're kind of an interesting firm because there aren't that, there obviously there are thousands of branding marketing firms out there, right? But there's very few that do what we do, which is true B2B, but even taking it one step further, and that is pure private equity work. And what's really interesting about that is that even though we're experts, all of us at the firm, we're experts in B2B, meaning business to business concepts. We get that. We understand that pretty well. But the reality is also that we're not only focused on private equity firms, we're focused on what we call portcos, which are the portfolio companies, meaning the companies that are owned by private equity firms. And that basically means that you also have to kind of start working on a lot of B2C clients. So the reality is, we have to be experts across the entire business realm, right? Not just B2B, but B2C. But the reality is, I think most of us at the firm started as B2B experts, and then we've transitioned to become B2C experts as well, simply because we are also focused on the portfolio companies of private equity firms. So, like I said earlier, because it's kind of an unusual space. And again, lots of B2B marketing branding firms out there, a lot of really good ones. But I would say only really a good handful that are only doing what we do, which is focused primarily on private equity and portfolio companies. But it ties into your earlier question, which is relating to the whole financial understanding of things. And the reality is, private equity firms are really interested in one thing. They're interested in putting up the money to make companies more efficient, more effective, but they're expecting a return on that investment in 3 to 5 years. So the reality is, we've come to learn or even prove at the firm that brand equity equates to greater value. And consequently, when we talk about those concepts to a private equity firm, that if they actually hire us to help them build a stronger brand, not just for their firm, but for the firms that they own, meaning the companies that they're invested in, then eventually that's going to create greater value down the road. And that's all they really care about. Meaning private equity firms they're putting in a lot of money to buy these firms, transforming them. And then the exit strategy is that in 3 to 5 years, they come out with a huge return on that investment. But what greater return on their investment than to build a stronger brand for those companies that they own? So the reality is, like I said earlier, Chris, we're kind of in a unique space, not a lot of competitors. We're really good at what we do. And we just have a really good understanding of finances combined with marketing, bring those concepts together. We can kind of talk the talk and build amazing brand equity.
Very cool. I'm curious about the level of pressure, right? So that I think there's always a pro and con working with some of these bigger fishes, right? So the level of pressure that's on you and your team as the growth marketers, as the ones that are responsible for driving the growth of some of these portfolio companies and their companies, right? Can you speak on that and how have you guys been able to really manage and kind of push through that?
Yeah. So just to make sure I understand the question, so are you asking about, larger competitors? Is that kind of the,
Well, I'm sorry, let me rephrase. So, given that you're working with portfolio companies and their goal is to basically have a return in 3 to 5 years, I would imagine that creates a little bit of pressure for
sure.
you and your team to perform.
Yeah, 100%. Sorry, I misunderstood there before, but yeah, I get what you're saying. So yeah, I obviously, it really is just, for us, it's just another pressure project, right? Whether it's work, for a private equity firm or any sort of B2B company, there's always pressure to perform, to make sure that the budgets that are being invested, that there's a return on those. But yes, you're 100% right. Private equity firms are kind of a unique animal. In reality, unfortunately, whether you like it or not, it's really all about the dollar and cents. Private equity firms, all they care about is making a profit at the end of their 3 to 5 year, investment there. So 100% agree with you. A lot of pressure. We have to make sure that we are performing at the highest levels. And obviously, like I said earlier, we have a pretty strong track record, and we can prove that a strong brand or even a stronger brand equates to higher value. And once we can prove that, and once we actually execute on that, in other words, actually build out, create a great strategy that we present to an executive team at a private equity firm, and if everybody's in agreement here and we start executing, which we're really good at, then there is no reason for why at the end of the project that we can't actually see the return on that huge branding investment.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I'm sure that they've done their due diligence on the portcos, the portfolio companies that, they want you guys to work on. So that brings up another question in terms of acquisition. So the way I'm seeing this, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but it's like if you can acquire a new private equity company to work with as a client, that then opens up all of the portfolio companies that they have underneath them. And typically how do you roll that out? Is it like, let's start with a pilot first, or hey, let's do this amount, or is it like, hey, our whole portfolio is coming in and like you guys are rebranding and doing your thing?
So I love what you just brought up there, Chris, because the reality is, if you think about it that way, and you're 100% right, right? So we get hired by the private equity firm to work on their portfolio companies. And usually I would say it's a few, right? A few, maybe one or two, or sometimes even three portfolio companies. And eventually, if we prove ourselves, they might give us more work. But the reality is that if you just think about it, the way that business is going, private equity firms are starting to own almost everything out there. I mean, every industry now is practically owned by private equity firms, right? So healthcare, technology companies, retail companies. Lately, you've seen a lot of sporting teams, the Buffalo Bills, right? A lot of European football teams are now, that's really where the trend started, really, believe it or not, with private equity firms owning sports franchises. So the whole world is starting to be owned by private equity firms, whether that's a positive or negative, that's for another day to discuss. But nevertheless, that's the reality of things. And to your point, we have endless amounts of work. The opportunities are just endless for us because now that we see that private equity firms are starting to buy up everything, and we can prove, as I said earlier, that a stronger brand equates to stronger value, then the reality is that we could literally be working for the next 50 years and still not have even touched or even skimmed the surface, right? So, to your point earlier, it's just an endless amount of work. We could be doing this for a really long time simply because private equity firms are investing in so many companies, so many industries. And, a lot of companies out there need that equity. And usually the only place that they can go to is usually a private equity firm, right? Or a bank,
Mhm.
I suppose, but
Mhm.
usually a private equity firm. And that hopefully that answers your question, which is that the reality is just, yes, it's the trend. Private equity firms are literally gobbling up everything. And for us, I guess it's a positive because we're experts in private equity. And for us, again, usually one private equity firm can give us, two or three projects, because they own all these different portfolio companies.
That makes sense. I'm always curious about this dynamic between sales and marketing. And so you as, a chief growth officer and, really being hands-on in the marketing piece, how do you look at that? And how do you kind of work with the portfolio companies? Because I don't know if you get any pushback from sales. Hey, the leads, or like, hey, the traffic isn't converting. And then it's like, well, hey, there's a whole nother side to this equation. How do you kind of handle that dynamic?
Yeah, sure. So it's interesting because I've worked for companies that have their own separate sales team. I would say even when I was working for these financial companies that I mentioned to you earlier, in the early part of my career, they're financial companies that had their own kind of sales team, their own sales department, separate from marketing and everything else that's happening, every other department at the firm. But management consulting firms and agencies are kind of unique in that the partners or the senior executives are the sales team, but they're also the ones that are delivering the work to the client, right? So the reality is it's almost as if you don't really have a separate, just solely, sorry, yeah, separate, unique sales team that's only focused on going out and getting opportunities. That's usually not the case. I mean, there are certain exceptions where you do see that in certain management consulting firms, but the reality is the partners are usually the ones that go out and try to get new opportunities, but they're also the ones responsible for the relationship with the client and then delivering the work to that client. So it's a difficult job. I mean, you have so many hats to wear as a senior executive of a consulting firm or an agency, but that's just the way the business model is structured. So for me, my position is I do a lot of different things in my firm, right? So I help with marketing strategy, PR, communications, AI strategy, obviously lately, But the reality is I'm also working on BD and then at the same time delivering exceptional, quality client work. It's a lot, right? It's a lot to do, but that's just usually the way it works at a consulting firm and agency, which is as a senior executive, which is what I am at my firm. I'm responsible for the strategy, generating opportunities, but also delivering quality impact work to the client as well. So it's a kind of an interesting dynamic. I don't see it being separate as you would with other companies where you have a unique marketing department and a separate sales department. That's just not the way that most consulting firms are structured. Yeah. And that's really it. It's usually the expert who's in branding also happens to be the person responsible for generating new opportunities.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thanks for clearing that up in my head. That's actually really good to know and understand.
Yeah.
Richard, you mentioned AI, and I know this is something that every industry is being affected by. Things are moving so fast, technology is being developed, but you have a very interesting and very specific take on AI or on humanizing it. Could you share a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. So the first thing that I'll mention is that, AI for many people, many executives, many marketers is a relatively new concept, right? I mean, we started hearing about ChatGPT maybe last year, right? But the reality is I started working with AI concepts about, I would say almost 5, 6 years ago, right? So these concepts around, let me take a step back and explain. So I worked for a consulting firm where in many ways, we were kind of ahead of our time. We were a revolutionary kind of firm that started using, and we're talking now 10 years ago, started understanding the importance of data and how data should actually be part of a strategy that you then deliver to clients to make those clients more operational efficient or effective. Mainly, I mean, if you're trying to solve issues around supply chain or, you know, strategic profitability improvement, data became such a huge element to the strategy that we delivered to clients. And this was before data was ever a big thing at a consulting firm. So again, this firm that I worked for understood the concept of data early on and how that could actually become a game changer and make companies more effective and more efficient. While I was at this firm, we then started also learning and using concepts around AI. Meaning, and not just AI, we're talking, before, as I mentioned, data, predictive analytics, machine learning, and then artificial intelligence concepts. So I've been involved in the whole AI quote unquote movement, if you want to call it that, for many years, not just in the last couple of years, as I would say most people have been. So I would actually truly say that I was an early AI adopter, right? And I understood the value of AI. I knew that this was going to be absolutely mind-boggling, and it was just going to change the entire dynamic of not just business life, but personal life, really everything. It was just going to obviously have just monumental implications. So consequently, I became an AI adopter eons ago. And because of that, I've been helping incorporate AI into a lot of strategies, a lot of ways of improving the operations of a company that I'm helping grow and build. So, I've been dabbling in AI for a number of years now, is the point. Number one. The thing that I've come to learn over this time is that I think we're getting, little by little, people are kind of understanding this, which is, how do we make sure that you're still keeping that human element of the AI alive, right? And I think people are in a way, I hate to put it this way, but I feel like they're almost becoming a little lazy by using AI because they're relying on it so much. In a way, I think what people are doing is almost doing it backwards. Just to give you an example, they're writing a piece of content. Actually, the reality is the opposite. They're using AI to write a piece of content, and then they themselves are then editing it a little bit. I think it should be the other way around. Write the piece of content, make it sound like you first, and then you use AI to maybe do the editing. In other words, I think people are getting a little lazy in that they know that it's very efficient. They know they can save a lot of time. But the reality is they're relying on it so much that you're losing that human element, that human touch. And in a way, the consequence of that is that you're turning off a lot of people. You're turning off your clients, you're turning off prospects, and you're not really getting that human connection anymore. And I feel like companies are becoming less trustworthy of companies. I mean, clients are becoming less trustworthy of companies simply because they're not feeling like there's a lot of a true human element or a human touch to a lot of what they're doing, whether, when it comes to sales or marketing. So again, I'm a big proponent of it. I love all the great things you can do with it, but I also feel you just need to use it the right way and make sure that the human element comes across first, as opposed to the other way around. It shouldn't sound like a machine first. It should sound like a human first. It's just I just think that people will eventually kind of learn this and make sure that they're actually leveraging AI in a way where it's actually helping them sound more human than ever before. So
That makes a lot of sense, and I think we can tell when something's written by AI. There's so many like little cues or triggers that's like, oh, that's AI. You can tell. So yeah, I agree with you there. I'm also curious how the industry that you're in, right? So private equity and portfolio companies. How are you guys leveraging AI inside of that industry to stay competitive?
yeah, sure. So I would say that there's a couple different things that we have been doing really for the last few years here. I would say that, anything relating to optimizing existing processes, right? I think is a
Mm.
big one. I would say that automating repeatable tasks or, even speeding up workflows. That's an excellent thing to be doing, using AI to kind of do those things. Increased outputs, especially as a marketer, SEO and white papers and ad creation and those kinds of things. I think you can use AI to, kind of do those things. And obviously there's the budget aspect of all these things. You can lower costs quite significantly by kind of leveraging AI resources. So I would say one thing is you augmenting with AI, right? But I would say the other side to that is also primarily almost architecting. In other words, AI architecture. And by that I mean that you can almost reimagine your entire organization, right? So instead of keeping things as they are and then using AI to kind of improve on those or make them more efficient, I would say you actually just do it the other way around. In other words, you kind of reimagine an entire marketing organization by putting AI first, right? Creative leads, growth leads, kind of entirely new, AI led workflows. What else? I would say kind of automated system creation, deployment, or analyzing or optimizing, kind of using AI first. So, I just seen there's two ways of doing it. I think you can either augment with AI or you can do kind of AI architecture. And those are the two ways that I've seen companies kind of leverage AI here in the last year.
Got it. Yeah, that makes sense. Getting ready to wrap up here, Richard. I have a couple more questions, and one that I'm curious about because our audience is oftentimes agency owners, right? And those that are working inside of agencies. And so I think as an agency owner, you start to realize that once you get to a certain point, playing the private equity game or participating in that game becomes really interesting because you're kind of creating these growth engines for the companies, your clients. And if you can participate in the upside of an acquisition or of an IPO or of, an M&A, there could potentially be much upside for you inside of the agency. What words of advice would you have other agency owners that might want to start looking at playing that game?
Yeah. So I would say, being part of an agency or even owning an agency is a very difficult position. It's a difficult job because there's literally thousands of agencies, right? Or consulting firms, literally thousands. And I just like any business, Chris, I think you just need to find something that differentiates you in the marketplace, right? We were able to find it, right? Where we just focused primarily one industry, private equity in the portfolio companies. That's a very unique thing. We became experts in that industry, that field. And the reality is instead of having 1,000 competitors, then we just have five, right? Okay. So I think that the best advice I can give to anybody who's either planning on joining an agency or a consulting firm or starting a new agency or consulting firm is just like anything else. You have to find differentiators. You need to stand out from the crowd. Otherwise, if you end up doing the exact same thing as every other consulting firm or agency out there, you're just commoditizing yourself. And really all you're competing on is cost. And the reality is once that happens, everybody loses. There is no winner when all you're doing is, or maybe the end buyer, I suppose, right? But the reality is every agency out there is losing if all they're doing is competing on cost because all you're doing is, oh, I can outbid this person to what? To zero practically. So the reality is the best advice I can give to anybody is number one, find something that you can sell or, a way of positioning yourself where it's so unique, especially in this field, in the agency consulting field. That would be number one. The second thing that I would mention is, partnerships are enormous. I don't think people realize how important partnerships are, especially as a new consulting firm or agency. And that is, I would try to leverage partnerships as much as you can, especially you may not have a ton of money to be spending on staff or even, a high level executive. Is find ways of creating partnerships where you're both, kind of helping each other. You offer one capability, another agency or consulting firm or organization offers a different capability. You kind of join forces a little bit. Who knows what could happen down the road? Maybe you become one company, But the reality is, I just think it's hard to do everything on your own, especially if you're a smaller firm. So, leverage your relationships, your partnerships. But I can't stress enough the idea of finding something that is so unique. And there's always ways of differentiating. And always, the last thing that I'll mention here, Chris, is simply that, you're always going to come up with new differentiators, right? There's always going to be new client needs, market demands, market trends. Every firm that I know is going to have to adapt to all these changes that are happening in the marketplace. Who you are today is not who you're going to be 5 years from now, right? So the reality is just kind of keep abreast of trends, continually find those differentiators, come up with new capabilities, and you should be doing, you should, hopefully do well. But it's a really difficult competitive landscape. But I think those three things should kind of help you a little bit on kind of navigating and hopefully getting through.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Richard. For anyone listening, is interested in learning more about anything that we spoke about here today, about you personally, or about Monogram, where can they find?
Yeah, you can go to our website, Monogram Group, or if you want to contact me directly, that's totally fine. I'm happy to chat. My email is Ashbaugh, so it's ASHBAUGH at monogramgroup.com. Those are his ways. Yep.
Cool. And we can link that in the show notes and everything as well to make it easier for everybody. So thanks so much for coming on today, Richard.
Amazing. Thank you for everything, Chris. Yep. Appreciate it.